This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. I'm Joe Hildebrand, and the real story this week is it's over. Finally, the economic crisis, the cost of living crisis. It's done. It's gone. Inflation is back to within the RBA's target bandwidth. Have you ever heard anyone get more emotional about the words target bandwidth? Even pronounce the words target bandwidth. Plus, is the Prime Minister seriously considering cracking down on negative gearing and the secret Indigenous shame that's literally being swept off our streets just so we can look good for the VIPs? All that and much, much more coming up. First up, let's take a deep dive into whatever the F is happening in the Australian economy. Now, it started at the beginning of the week with inflation being stubbornly high. And this is what the RBA Governor Michelle Bullock is talking about when she refused to cut interest rates on Tuesday. It's not that inflation is too high, or it's not even that headline inflation is too high, but it's that underlying inflation that's too high, or not even so much too high, but just stubbornly high, like a teenager. Anyway, what is actually going on? Why are these numbers, which look on the surface to be pretty low and which most people feel are low because, everyone I speak to, everyone you probably speak to is copping it in the neck, is cutting back on their spending. And this is bringing inflation down, isn't it? Yes, it is. Because the day after the Reserve Bank refused to cut interest rate, the new inflation figure come out. It's the lowest in 3 years. This is the September quarter inflation figure. It's the lowest in 3 years. And not only that, it got lower every month. So June, July, August, inflation got lower and lower and lower. Like a Sara Lee cheesecake. Lower upon lower upon lower. Now, the inflation rate now, and I can tell you, the PM and the government are pretty happy about this, is 2.7%. That is within the RBA's target bandwidth of 2 to 3%. In other words, the RBA wants inflation to be higher than 2% because that shows the economy's ticking over nicely, but lower than 3% because if it's higher than that, it means it's getting too hot, it's out of control, and the RBA's got to jack up interest rates. I'm sure you all know that, but I'm an art student, so I'm just explaining it to myself. So why, now that inflation is back to where the RBA wants it to be, the lowest it's been basically since the pandemic, 3 years ago in 2001, they're still saying they're not going to be cutting interest rates probably until at least next year. There's a small chance maybe in December, but RBA Governor Michelle Bullock, homie, don't play that. She is as tough as nuts. So, why is this happening? Well, according to the Daily Mail, we all know who's to blame. It's those dirty migrants coming over to Australia and spending all their money, putting it into our economy just like we asked them to, just like we want them to. In fact, it's international students. Remember them? Those terrible, terrible young people coming in from all over the world, paying thousands upon thousands of dollars to our universities so that local students can get their degrees thanks to the taxpayer, only have to pay back a little bit of HECS later on. Those terrible, dirty immigrants coming here, causing our high inflation. But wait, inflation's gone down. Inflation's now 2.7%, and that article came out before the official figures. So I guess we should thank all the international students. Thank you, migrants. Thank you for helping us. But is there actually a bit of truth in it? Well, yes, there is. And far be it from me to ever denigrate the great Daily Mail. But so the story of these inflation figures is that Australian households are indeed cutting their spending, which is exactly what the RBA is using the sledgehammer of rate rises to force us to do. So it's saying, you're going to pay so much on your mortgage, so much in interest, that you're not going to have any money to spend anywhere else. Suffer, little peasant. And we go, okay, thank you very much. Yep, we see the big picture. Thank you, macroeconomic masters. And we've stopped spending. But of course, that's not a luxury that people who come in from overseas have. They've got to buy food, they've got to buy their necessities, and of course we're bringing plenty of people in. The migration numbers are still pretty high, not quite as high as their peak, but they're still pretty high, and that is largely fueled by international students. And lest anyone miss my sarcasm before, we want them to be here. Education is Australia's third or fourth largest export, behind iron ore, coal, all that stuff we dig out of the ground that China buys. Thank you very much. But in return, they send us a lot of their young people to study at our universities, and they pay shite loads of money for the privilege. And that money goes to our higher education institutions and it goes into our economy. And that helps the GDP. And so, yes, while it may be putting upwards pressure on inflation, it's also helping our economic growth. And remember when everyone was bashing up the government for not having high enough economic growth, then at the same time bashing it up for having too much inflation? They're kind of the same thing. It kind of goes together. You see what I'm getting at here? So it's not quite as simple as stop all the migrants and everything will be fine. And don't get me started on the housing shortage. Anyway, now that the inflation number has been confirmed as being about 2.7%, or more to the point, very specifically 2.7%, within the RBA's targeted bandwidth, why aren't we looking at the prospect of rate cuts sooner rather than later? Well, there are a couple of reasons for this. One is a little bit of Keynesian economics. Sorry, I said I'd make it sexy for you, so let me try that again. One is a little bit of Keynesian economics. And that basically means the government is intervening in the market and artificially lowering the cost of some things. In particular, one very important thing, and that is energy. And you might have heard on this podcast, and if you did, you'd be ahead of the ball because you would have found out the real story already. But the way the government has targeted its power bill relief is so that it comes off the power bill before it gets to the consumer. So the consumer just sees a lower power bill. It's not like they get a voucher in their hot little hand that they can then use to put on the higher power bill and bring that down. So what does that mean? That means that the price of power on the surface looks like it's come down by whatever the government has offset it by, in this case, $300 over the course of a year. So power prices have come down, but that is because the government has stepped in to make them come down, and that is to provide relief for consumers, but it's also to make it look like inflation's going down, which is what they want and what they want to do. And RBA going to Michelle Book goes, no, I see what you did there. I'm not falling for that old chestnut. So that's one thing she's not taking into account, which is anything where the government has artificially, if you like, lowered the rate of inflation. The other thing, of course, has been really, really high inflation in the most important, and survey after survey is showing this, and you don't need a survey, you can see it etched in people's faces, but the most important and cruel feature of the cost of living crisis, which is the cost of housing, literally just being able to find a roof over your head and afford to keep it. And while the 2.7% might be the overall headline rate of inflation, when it comes to rentals, when it comes to actually finding a place to rent. So before you're even thinking about being able to afford to buy a place, just the inflation for the rental itself, good news, it's come down too. Bad news is it's come down from 7% and a bit to 6% and a bit%. So it's still more than double the rate of inflation of everything else. So rent is still incredibly, incredibly tight. And this, of course, is where you do get sort of legitimate sort of arguments about, oh my God, are we bringing in too many people? Again, the number of migrants coming in has gone down, but it's gone down from about 570,000 to about 510,000. So, there's still a lot of people coming in. People are saying, oh no, we can't afford to put all these people in houses, and they're taking houses or rooms or flats or whatever that Australians could live in. But the problem is that we don't have enough skilled workers in the country to build all the houses that we need to live in ourselves. And so to bring in the people to do that, guess what? We've got to bring in migrants. We've got to bring in skilled workers from overseas so that we can build the houses. And yes, they are going to have to live in the houses, or somewhere at least, while they're building them. So where are they going to live? Well, this brings us to the next big story of the week. Yes, and just when you thought that, like work choices, it was dead, buried and cremated, negative gearing rises from the ashes, phoenix-like, to rear its ugly head in the Australian political landscape. Though not actually negative gearing itself, but changes to negative gearing, eliminating negative gearing. Now, what is negative gearing? People bandy it around. They bandy it around almost like target bandwidth. Negative gearing is this weird feature of the Australian property market. I don't think it exists in the same form pretty much anywhere else in the world. And if you were designing a tax system today or designing a housing market today, you would not touch this thing with a barge pole. It was never even meant to be here. It's like the house guest that no one invited and now refuses to leave. But as my mum's special friend Don said when he didn't want to make 2 trips into town to have the dog put down, Chris, we're here now. And we're here now. Negative gearing is baked into the Australian economy. It is baked into the Australian housing market, and it is baked into many normal, everyday people's aspirations. The people I know who are most negatively geared aren't, high-flying lawyers or bankers or doctors or whatever, and not me. I have one house and I'm struggling to pay for that. I don't got no room, no money, no nothing for another one. But the people I know who have used this as basically their future, their nest egg, their retirement strategy, are a couple, they're both cops. You don't get more blue collar than that. Their collars are literally blue. Working class people, a few kids, and they're leveraged to the hilt. They've got no money in the bank. They're using negative gearing to provide security for themselves and their kids down the track. Okay, so they're aspirational. They're far from flush or rich. They don't come from money. They're using this to build their way up in the world. So these are the sort of people that these changes that are being mooted could affect. So firstly, what is negative gearing and what are the changes that are being mooted? Well, negative gearing is a deal that was put forward yonks ago to encourage investment in the stock market, basically. It was to encourage investment in stocks and shares so that, everyone would become part of the great sort of Australian economy and yay for capitalism and usually get a better return than you would if it was just sitting in the bank and the money's out there in the economy doing something. It's improving GDP and that's going to grow the economy and that means more stuff for all of us and a wealthier Australia and yay, everybody hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Fantastic, right? And so to encourage this investment, the government said, look, any interest you pay on money that you borrow to invest, you can write off your tax. So you can just subtract whatever interest you have to pay on whatever you borrow to invest, you can subtract that from your taxable income. Okay, all well and good. We're encouraging people to get into the stock market, get in on the ground floor and, get the country moving, get the economy rolling around in the hay. Fantastic. So people did that. But then one little bright spark somewhere, tragically, we'll probably never know their name, but an accountant said, hang on a minute. If we can claim all the interest we pay on loans that we borrow for an investment, that doesn't have to be an investment in the share market. That could be an investment anywhere, couldn't it? It could be an investment property. And so suddenly all these people start jumping on the bandwagon and they're claiming the interest that they have to pay on their loans against their tax for housing. And this means it's suddenly very attractive to buy a second or a third or a fourth house. And of course, then another very clever little accountant comes up with the idea of the interest-only loan. So instead of paying off a bit of the capital of the loan and a bit of interest, they just put all the interest up the front and you make it all interest, which means you can claim everything you pay against your tax. And it means that you can build up your money or your property portfolio pretty quick and often in many cases end up paying little or no net tax to the good citizens of Australia, at least initially, when you're buying these properties. And of course, by the time you do get to the bit where you're paying off the principal of the loan, which you can't claim on your tax, that property is now rocketed up in value and you can sell it to some poor, unsuspecting 25-year-old just trying to start out with his girlfriend in life and a little dog called Spot, and they're paying $1 billion, but they've got 20 grand from John Howard. Anyway, look, point being, it's not really what it was meant to do. This is not what negative gearing was actually designed for, but it's what it's being used for, and it's here now. And so the left has always had its eye on saying this is just bollocks. It's not rational. It doesn't make sense. What the left, of course, has never really been very good at understanding is that what is rational and what is popular are two very, very, very different things. They've also been pretty bad historically about understanding economic forces, which is why, as Graham Richardson famously said of Gough Whitlam, he always got frustrated when the economy wouldn't do what he told it to. Anyway, there's now a suggestion from someone within the government, some weird unnamed official, which is quite strange because officials are meant to be bureaucrats. They're not meant to be sort of policy decision makers. They're people who design the policy that the politicians ask them to. Anyway, we do seem to know that there's some kind of modelling that's been commissioned to find out what changes could be made to negative gearing. And this has alarmed a whole bunch of people who are saying, hang on a minute, this is the policy that cost Bill Shorten the unlosable election. In 2019, there was absolutely no way that Bill Shorten could have lost the election to Scott Morrison, and yet somehow Labor managed to do just that. And a very big reason why, if not the biggest reason why, was because of the proposed cuts or changes it was making to negative gearing, which, although weren't the end of the world and had a whole bunch of caveats, they were going to grandfather some stuff, and if you were buying new houses, you'd still be able to do it. And that was meant to increase supply. But still, it was enough to scare the horses, and one of, if not the major reason, Bill Shorten is not Prime Minister today. And now Labor has reached into the back of the cupboard, dusted it off and said, I wonder if this thing still goes. And that's what's got a lot of people very, very nervous. Again, not because the policy is irrational or because it is bad, but because it looks bad. It sends a bad signal. It makes it look like the Labor Party is against aspiration, against middle-class people getting ahead. It makes it look like it's, part of class war, that it wants to tear down the rich. It's just not a good look. And it's not a good look when the business community and the government are not exactly the best of friends at the moment. So people I've spoken to in the government have been very ambivalent or very coy about what they're doing. A lot of them obviously will be thinking that it's just like the tax cuts. We broke that promise and everyone loved it. But it's not just like the tax cuts, because the tax cuts took a bit of money from people who were getting a lot and they still got some, and all that money then went to people who weren't going to get very much or any at all. And so instantly you had about 80 to 90% of people who were instantly getting money when they weren't going to get that money. They're going, hey, that's a pretty good idea. Thank you very much. And the people who were losing that extra bit of tax but we're still getting a tax cut anyway, their voices kind of got drowned out, and everyone on that side of the ledger realised pretty quickly that it wasn't a good look for them to be telling people who earned a tenth of their income that they couldn't get a tax cut because they'd been waiting so long for theirs. The difference with the negative gearing changes is that even if down the track they make it easier for a first home buyer to buy their first home, that first home buyer is not going to then jump in a time machine, travel back to 2025 and vote for the Albanese government at the next election. So you'll be taking something away from a whole bunch of people who are using it to secure their future, making them very, very angry. A lot of these people are probably quite important people. They'd be captains of industry. They'd be, dare I say it, politicians. A few of them with investment properties. And you'd be making them all upset, while at the same time the people who would reap the benefits wouldn't be reaping the benefits for months or years to come. So pretty politically crazy, if you ask me. Speaking of crazy, I want to take you just briefly to the beautiful suburb of Unley in Adelaide. It's a great little place. Julie Guide went to school there, incidentally, Unley High. Been to Unley High myself, walked through those hallowed halls. Sadly didn't get a scholarship, but I was in my 30s at the time, so I guess they had their reasons. But Unley Council has done a very strange thing. It's done a couple of very strange things, actually. Unley Council decided to change the date of Australia Day from January 26th to January 25th. It then held a survey of its residents, and that survey found that 60% of said residents, perhaps even a bit more, I believe, wanted it changed back. So just to get the order of services correct, Unley Council makes the decision to change the date of Australia Day, or the citizenship ceremonies and all the stuff they do on that day, then seeks consultation about it. So it first does the thing, then it asks its residents, its ratepayers, whether they should have done the thing, and then finds out that the vast majority of them say, no, we didn't want you to do that. And now they're considering changing it back. And imagine how that's going to go down. These are the sort of ridiculous debates, decisions that are being made and debated all over the country. Every year, like clockwork, there's a debate over Australia Day. But anyway, whatever, it doesn't matter. I don't care. What I do care about is the fact that there are two Australias. There is an Indigenous Australia and a non-Indigenous Australia. Not As in there was an Indigenous Australia before January 26, 1788, and then a non-Indigenous one afterwards. No, right here, right now, there is a white and black Australia that, for the most part, when you're looking at Indigenous communities in remote areas, are living completely different lives. You would not even know you're on the same planet, let alone in the same country. And one of those places is in itself almost on another planet. The Northern Territory is an awesome place. I go there whenever I can. And we now find from Stephen Rice in The Australian, great reporter, absolute legend, he has been speaking to some Indigenous Northern Territory police officers and community liaison officers who are blowing the whistle on the culture in the Northern Territory Police Force. And there's been a bit of that in the media you would have seen. But they're saying that it's a, at times very racist organisation. We'll see how that plays out and if all those claims are true. But what he has managed to extract from these whistleblowers is what a lot of people in the Territory always suspected, which is that any time a VP comes to town, the police will actually sweep all the Indigenous people, itinerant Indigenous people, gets them off the street so the streets look nice and clean for the VIP so that when they come to town, wherever it is, in Alice or Darwin or Catherine or wherever, everything looks nice. And look, there's no Indigenous disadvantage here. There's no problem. Everything's great. Look, here's a designated delegate to say hi and how happy everybody is. There you go. Thank you very much, Prime Minister or Your Excellency or whoever it may be. And they are literally sweeping this problem under the carpet. They're hiding it from view. Saying, look, there's nothing to see. And then, of course, everyone acts surprised when something blows up in Alice Springs. Oh, where did that come from? Well, anyone who knows the Territory, anyone who's stuck their head into what really happens in Indigenous politics and communities knows where it came from. It's chronic disadvantage. But instead of actually finding ways to tackle it, instead of even acknowledging it, we're having stupid debates about Australia Day. And you wonder why the voice to Parliament didn't get up. One of the biggest stories of the week has been this revelation by the ACCC, or allegation at least. They're investigating and it remains to be seen whether it can be proven, but that the big two supermarkets, Kohls and Woolies, of whom I am a loyal devotee. I'm actually a card-carrying Kohls Flybuys member. Let's face it, I'm there every day just trying to ratchet up those points, get that cookware. Went to Woolies, got the Disney cards, got the whole set. I'm all in. I'm emotionally invested. Anyway, back to the actual story. They've been found to have been fiddling with their prices so that when you see a price that says, locked and dropped or down, that it's actually a price that they have artificially inflated, or maybe inflated for very good reasons because of supply chain shortages and consumer demand, for about, 3 weeks or so, and then suddenly cut it to less than the upper level that they'd inflated it to, but more than it was in the first place. Are you following me here? We're going through the looking glass, people. And so they actually present a higher price as being a lower price, because even though it's lower than the temporary spike, it's higher than what the product used to be. Now, if you are still scratching your head and going, what the hell is going on here? Don't worry, you're not alone. I've got an expert with me to talk us through it. Her name is Jeannie Paterson. She's a law professor from the University of Melbourne, and she joins me right now on The Real Story. G'day, Jeannie. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Now, apologies for my emotional breakdown, but I love supermarkets. There's something in my blood about it. I end up at them pretty much every day. I'm always buying something. I've always forgotten something. I'm always going back. I've since become obsessed with especially the Kohls Flybuys program because someone gave me a Virgin Velocity card and now I'm desperately scared. I have status anxiety. I'm worried about losing my points. I'm already gone from gold to silver. I can't go back to bronze. I can't. I won't. And this seems to me like it's quite a, I don't know, is it too strong to say betrayal of trust?
Oh, I think it's a betrayal of trust, actually, for precisely the reasons you say. I'm a busy mother. I go to the supermarket. I shop quickly. I look at the tags. So if I see something that says discount, I don't get my calculator out and think back to what I paid 3 weeks ago. I suppose I don't get out my laptop computer and think about what I paid 3 weeks ago and then compare the discount. I assume it's a real discount.
And I'm also one of those people who, and I'm very lucky now, but I'm not pretending I'm crying poor now, but I did grow up poor. I grew up in Dandenong, and you know, my mum once made me take a bag of lemons back to the supermarket just because I'd paid too much money for them. She just didn't like the sticker price. So now I've got all my sort of emotional childhood baggage out of the way. Let's just get into the sort of the nuts and bolts of what of where it stands and perhaps even how this came about. Firstly, is there in your mind any plausible explanation for all these products going up in price very suddenly and by quite a lot for a very short period of time? Is it possible that all these different spikes were caused by, you know, one-off events or supply chain problems, and the supermarkets are actually being perfectly honest?
Of course it's possible, and I haven't seen all the data that the ACCC collected. But the ACCC is alleging this conduct occurred in the case of Woolworths across 266 products across 20 months and 245 products for Kohls across 15 months. So it's not a couple of products now and then, it's a fairly sustained pattern of events.
It was Oscar Wilde's Lady Bracknell said to lose one parent is a misfortune, to lose two looks like carelessness. And we are dealing with approximately 500 products across the two main supermarket companies. So it would be a lot of, I suppose, one-off incidental price spikes in the supply chain. We're talking about Kohls and Woolies here. Now, we know that these guys aren't necessarily the best of friends, although some people might accuse them of being a duopoly. But it's passing strange that the two biggest supermarket chains, if the ACCC's allegations are to be believed, have been doing the exact same thing in the exact same way on the exact same type of products, which seems, again, to suggest, dare I say it, far be it from me to spout a conspiracy theory, that perhaps these are not kind of organic market forces at play.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're different products in both cases, but both supermarkets seem to have been doing it. Now, the ACCC has made clear that they're not alleging collusion between the supermarkets. They're not saying that. But we do know that the supermarkets watch each other's prices, and we do know that that Kohls had this very successful down campaign. Right, yeah. So Woolworths came up with prices dropped. Yeah. So we know that they watch each other. So, you know, the fact that they go up and then right down, that could well be supermarkets watching each other. But that's not what the case is brought on. The case is brought on both supermarkets who have engaged in what the ACCC says is misleading conduct across this large range of products over a sustained period of time. And Kohls has come out and said, oh, well, that's the pressure of supplier costs. Woolworths hasn't really made a statement on that. It will be interesting to see where both supermarkets choose to go and whether one will continue and one will concede, or whether they'll both take this to litigation, in which case it will take a couple of years.
The other thing I want to ask, this is obviously, you know, in some ways an ingenious piece of marketing. Can you talk us through, as a law professor, what is actually illegal about it? I mean, they're saying that the price is lower than it was on this other date, even if that might not exactly be the sort of spirit of the law. Technically, according to the letter of the law, they are being absolutely truthful. The prices are lower today than they were on the date that they are specifying, when admittedly they were higher than usual.
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really important point, because technically a person who read the ticket got in the right information. They got that the starting price was here and the discounted price was there, so that the price had started at one point, gone to another. The Woolworths or Kohls didn't advise that 2 weeks ago or 20 days ago, the price had been different. But technically, you know, they don't have to. But our law doesn't work on a really lawyer's tricky fine print approach, which is what we're really talking about here. The interesting thing about the law in Australia, the Australian consumer law, is that it has a prohibition on misleading conduct, and misleading conduct isn't limited to, was the fine print right? It's about the impression that is created in the ordinary and reasonable member of a target audience. So here the target audience is supermarket shoppers. And we've got lots of cases on supermarkets and we've got lots of cases on advertising. And what the courts have said is that when a person is shopping or listening to advertising, they're not applying the same attention to it that they would apply to, say, a contract. So if you're entering into a contract with a bank or you're buying a house or you're buying a car, you know those terms and conditions that you're presented with are really important, and you probably read them or at least look at them carefully. But when we're shopping or looking at advertising or marketing, we're giving it a fleeting attention is the words the court use. And in the case of marketing, we're often caught in what the court calls the web of deception of marketing. So we don't have to apply the same care. And the impression created by this marking of the products as reduced, at least this is the ACCC's argument, is that it conveyed to customers that they were getting a good deal. This is a good deal for you, not, hey guys, the cost of living and the cost of supply means this product is more expensive. And so consumers were misled in their impression of what they were getting. And that can be enough in Australia.
And this has prompted the Albanese government to fast-track new laws regulating the behaviour about supermarkets. Talk us through how that... Well, do you think they will effectively stop this sort of thing from happening again? Or if the laws are already there that the ACCC is using, why do we need these new restrictions?
Well, ideally, we'd have law in place that stops this happening rather than it happening, than the courts or the ACCC having to come in after the fact. There's been a lot of concern about the duopoly of supermarkets in Australia for a while, and many people will remember the concern about the treatment of dairy farmers with $1 milk, that in fact dairy farmers were being squeezed really hard by the supermarkets. So the reforms to supermarkets are not just about customers, they're actually also about Australian farmers and small suppliers that don't have the bargaining power to push for a reasonable price for their products. So suppliers need a reasonable price for their products, and consumers need to not have price gouging, which is where the price of the product goes up more than the increase in the cost of supply. And that's a question that this case actually doesn't address.
Great. Jeannie Paterson, thank you very much for joining us on The Real Story.
You're welcome.
Well, that's all we have time for today. In fact, it's far more than we actually had time for today, which is why my lovely producer, Anna, is now staring at me with the fire of 1,000 suns. Thanks for listening, and if you love what you hear, leave a rating and a review, not you, Anna. And if you want us to cover anything on the pod, can we please put the word cast after that? Because when I say pod, I feel like Ricardo having his little midlife crisis down the corridor, okay? Not wearing any socks today. Reach out via socials, via email. It's therealstory@novapodcast.com.au, or you can just slide into my DMs on the gram. My handle is @Joe_Hildebrand. And of course, if you want to hear more from me and find out what's really going on in the world, you can always read my columns in the Daily Telegraph and other news mastheads every Monday and Saturday. Thanks for your company. I'll see you next week.